the night that changed West Memphis forever. It began like any other humid evening in West Memphis, Arkansas, a small town where nothing truly terrifying was supposed to happen. But on May 5th, 1993, three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, vanished without a trace. By morning, their bicycles lay abandoned near a muddy creek, and soon, their lifeless bodies were found submerged in a shallow ditch in Robin Hood Hills. Naked, bound, and brutally beaten, they bore the marks of a nightmare no one could explain. According to official records, the discovery site was a scene of inexplicable violence. The children had been tied wrist to ankle, their small limbs contorted unnaturally. The brutality suggested ritualistic overtones, something dark, almost satanic. As word spread, the town erupted in fear. Whispered rumors of cults and black masses filled the air. And before the sun set again, police would claim they had found their monsters. But what happened next would divide a nation, destroy 3 young lives, and expose a justice system eager to believe the unthinkable. The story of the West Memphis Three isn't just about murder. It's about hysteria. It's about how truth can drown beneath fear, faith, and the need for someone, anyone, to blame. It began in the blood-soaked mud of a small southern creek, and it hasn't truly ended to this day. The investigation begins, a town consumed by fear. By the morning of May 6, 1993, West Memphis had become a crime scene. The discovery of the boys' bodies shocked the community to its core. Police sealed off the wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills, but in their panic, crucial evidence was trampled, washed away, or simply overlooked. What could have been a meticulous forensic investigation quickly descended into chaos. According to the initial reports, the bodies showed signs of mutilation. One child, Christopher Byers, had injuries that investigators believed were sexual in nature, fueling dark theories of ritual sacrifice. Officers whispered about satanic symbols and occult gatherings. But beyond speculation, there was no solid evidence of such practices. Yet in the Bible Belt of America, the very suggestion was enough to ignite hysteria. By evening, local news outlets began broadcasting words like ritual, cult, and sacrifice. Parents locked their doors. Churches organized prayer circles. People wanted answers and someone to hold accountable. Enter the West Memphis Police Department, under pressure to solve the case fast. Detectives Bryn Ridge and Gary Gitchell became the faces of the investigation. Gitchell, in a televised interview, told reporters he was 110% sure the case would be solved soon. Behind that confidence, however, was desperation. The town was gripped by what would later be called satanic panic. Across the U.S., a moral frenzy had taken hold, a fear that hidden satanic cults were sacrificing children in the shadows of suburbia. And West Memphis became the perfect stage for that fear to play out. Within days, the police had their eyes on a suspect, a local teenager with a dark wardrobe, an interest in heavy metal, and a reputation for being different. His name was Damien Echols. But the truth about what led to his arrest would reveal more about human fear than about evidence. Damien Echols, the outcast. In the small conservative town of West Memphis, Damien Echols stood out like a dark silhouette against the church steeples. 17 years old, pale, with long black hair and a fascination for horror novels and heavy metal, he was, in the eyes of many, the embodiment of everything evil parents warn their children about. According to teachers and neighbors, Damien was quiet, intelligent, but deeply misunderstood. He had dropped out of high school due to depression and poverty, living with his mother in a rundown trailer. His fascination with occult symbols, combined with his gothic appearance, made him a target long before the murders ever occurred. In a town still gripped by fear and religious fervor, that was enough to mark him as dangerous. Police reports later revealed that Damien was on their radar from the very beginning, not because of evidence, but because he fit the profile. When Detective Bryn Ridge compiled a list of potential suspects, Echols' name was highlighted with one simple note: occult involvement likely. Meanwhile, Damien's friends, Jason Baldwin and Jessie Misskelley, were also drawn into the growing storm. Baldwin, a quiet 16-year-old who idolized Echols, and Misskelley, a mentally challenged 17-year-old with an IQ of 72, often hung around together. They listened to Metallica, wore black, and sketched pentagrams in their notebooks. To the adults of West Memphis, that was proof enough. Rumors began to spiral out of control. People claimed to have seen Damien performing rituals in the woods. Others whispered that he drank animal blood or carried out dark ceremonies. None of it was ever verified, but to a terrified community, truth mattered less than comfort, and blaming the strange kid who read Stephen King novels brought a sense of control back to the chaos. By late May, investigators had decided to act. They would extract a confession, no matter the cost. And they found their opening in the most vulnerable of the three, the slow-speaking boy named Jessie Misskelley. What happened next would become one of the most controversial confessions in American criminal history. The confession that shocked the nation. On June 3, 1993, 17-year-old Jessie Misskelley Jr. was brought into the West Memphis Police Department for questioning. He wasn't under arrest. He wasn't read his rights properly, and he didn't have a lawyer or a parent present. What followed was a marathon interrogation, over 12 hours long, that would change everything. Jessie, a young man with limited mental capacity and a strong desire to please authority figures, became the centerpiece of the investigation. Detectives Ridge and Gitchell pressured him relentlessly, feeding him details of the crime and correcting him whenever his story didn't align with their version. Each inconsistency was met with hints, suggestions, and subtle manipulation. According to the official transcript, Jessie's statements were chaotic, filled with contradictions. He said the murders happened in the morning, though the boys had disappeared in the evening. He placed the crime at different locations. He even named victims incorrectly at times. Yet, after hours of prodding, he finally gave the police what they wanted, a confession. When news broke that Misskelley had confessed to participating in a satanic ritual murder with Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin, the town's collective fear turned to fury. The police held a press conference claiming victory. "We got them," Gitchell declared, smiling. But what the cameras didn't show was the heavily edited nature of Jessie's taped confession. Only 46 minutes of the 12-hour interrogation were recorded. The rest, according to investigators, was unnecessary material. What remained was a confusing, manipulated narrative, one that conveniently matched the prosecution's theory of a satanic killing. Jessie's defense would later argue that he was coerced, tricked, and exploited by police desperate for an arrest. He had an IQ barely above the threshold for intellectual disability. Experts would later testify that individuals like Jessie are highly suggestible, especially under pressure. But none of that mattered to the community of West Memphis. They wanted justice or vengeance. And so, on the strength of that confession, police arrested Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin within 24 hours. The West Memphis Three were born. The media called it a devil's trio. The prosecution called it an open and shut case. But behind the headlines, the truth was already slipping away, buried beneath fear, faith, and fabrication. The arrests and the satanic narrative. The morning after Jessie Misskelley's coerced confession, the town awoke to headlines screaming about satanic murderers. Within hours, police descended upon two teenagers who would soon become infamous, Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin. Their arrest was not the result of forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, or motive. It was the culmination of panic, rumor, and a desperate desire for closure. When officers arrived at Damien's home, he didn't resist. According to official reports, he was calm, even eerily composed, as if he already understood that the town had chosen him as its villain. Jason Baldwin was arrested soon after, handcuffed in front of his mother. Cameras were already waiting outside the station, capturing every angle. The story had become spectacle. Inside the interrogation rooms, investigators pushed the satanic theory hard. They spoke of black candles, blood rituals, and the phases of the moon. Police claimed Damien's journals contained references to witchcraft and devil worship. The later reviews would show most of his writings were about depression, poetry, and Eastern mysticism. Yet to the officers and prosecutors, the narrative fit too perfectly to question. The prosecution's lead investigator, Detective Gitchell, told the press, "We are dealing with individuals who worship the devil." That statement alone sealed the public's perception. Churches denounced the accused from their pulpits. Reporters described them as cult leaders. In the Bible Belt, there could be no greater sin than serving Satan. Meanwhile, no physical evidence linked the boys to the crime scene. The so-called satanic elements were never scientifically confirmed. Animal predation was later proven to have caused many of the injuries initially labeled as ritualistic mutilations. Still, the machinery of justice kept turning, powered by hysteria and public rage. Damien's black clothing became ceremonial robes. His love for Metallica became music of the devil. Jason's drawings were called symbols of dark worship. Even Damien's reading list, Stephen King, Aleister Crowley, Anne Rice, was twisted into proof of guilt. The prosecution built its entire case not on evidence, but on aesthetics and fear. Local news amplified the frenzy. One anchor called the teenagers disciples of Satan. Another reporter described them as agents of evil hiding in plain sight. By the end of June 1993, the town of West Memphis was convinced that three poor, misunderstood kids had summoned the devil and sacrificed children in his name. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Some officers quietly admitted there were inconsistencies. Others felt the evidence was paper thin. Still, no one dared to challenge the narrative. To question it would be to question the entire justice system, and few were brave enough to do that. And so the stage was set. The West Memphis Three were branded as monsters. The trials ahead would become not only about murder, but about America's obsession with evil itself. The trial of Damien, Jason, and Jessie, the trials of the West Memphis Three, were less about justice and more about theater. By January 1994, West Memphis had transformed its courthouse into a stage for the spectacle the public demanded. Crowds gathered daily outside, waving signs that read "Justice for the boys" and "Satan will burn." The accused, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley, were paraded past reporters as if already condemned. Misskelley was tried first, separately, due to his confession. The prosecution leaned heavily on his taped statement, ignoring its inconsistencies and the 12 hours of unrecorded coercion. Jessie's defense attorney pointed out that his client had recanted almost immediately, insisting he had been manipulated. But it didn't matter. The jury, moved by the gruesome descriptions and satanic framing, found him guilty of first-degree and second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life plus 40 years. Then came the joint trial of Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin, arguably one of the most biased proceedings in modern American history. The prosecution's case rested on symbolism and innuendo. A so-called occult expert, Dale Griffiths, testified that black clothing, heavy metal music, and interest in witchcraft were signs of satanic behavior. Griffiths held a PhD from a mail-order university. But the jury never learned that. To them, his words sounded scientific. The defense struggled. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no physical evidence connecting the boys to the crime. Witnesses contradicted each other. One claimed Damien had bragged about the killings at a softball game, a story that changed with every retelling. Another said she overheard him confess under the full moon. None of it was verifiable. Still, it painted a vivid picture for the jury. Three teenagers, possessed by darkness, sacrificing children to the devil. In the courtroom, Damien remained composed. Sometimes he smiled faintly, a gesture the media called cold and remorseless. To the jury, his calm demeanor seemed sinister. Prosecutors exploited it ruthlessly, portraying him as the ringleader, a charismatic sociopath who had led the others into evil. Jason Baldwin, the youngest, sat silently beside him, tears often filling his eyes. He had no criminal record, no motive, and had been in school during the time of the murders. But guilt by association was enough. When the verdicts came in, the room fell silent. Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Damien Echols, barely 18, was sentenced to death by lethal injection. As the gavel struck, a cheer erupted outside the courthouse. Reporters called it justice served. Families of the victims wept and embraced. But in the shadows of the courtroom, observers whispered that something was wrong, that the evidence was built on air and fear. One journalist described it best. It was not a trial of murder. It was a trial of culture, of appearance, of difference. The West Memphis Three were locked away. The town returned to its uneasy peace. But beyond Arkansas, questions began to spread. Had 3 innocent boys just been sacrificed on the altar of hysteria? Life behind bars. Silence, letters, and growing doubt. After the verdict, the doors closed forever. Or so it seemed. Jessie Misskelley and Jason Baldwin were sent to separate state prisons, swallowed by concrete and silence. Damien Echols was taken to death row at the Varner Supermax unit, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with despair. He was the youngest inmate on death row in Arkansas, barely 18 years old. According to official records, Damien spent 23 hours a day in isolation. His world was a narrow concrete cell, a metal bunk, and a slot in the door through which guards slid trays of food. The lights never truly went out. The screams of other prisoners echoed through the corridors like ghosts trapped between worlds. "It's like being buried alive," Damien later wrote in his memoir, Life After Death. In the beginning, he believed the truth would save them. But weeks turned into months, months into years. Appeals were denied one after another. Every letter he sent to the courts vanished into bureaucracy. Hope began to decay like rust on metal. The world outside forgot the West Memphis Three, or so it seemed. Then, something unexpected began to happen. Letters started arriving, first a few, then hundreds. Strangers from across the country wrote to Damien. Some were true believers, others just curious, but a handful were determined to uncover the truth. Among them were documentary filmmakers, journalists, and musicians. They began to dig into the original trial transcripts and police files. What they found shocked them. Evidence had been misrepresented, witnesses coerced, and DNA testing virtually non-existent. It became clear that the conviction rested on a foundation of hysteria rather than proof. Small cracks began to appear in the official story, and the public's certainty started to waver. Damien, from his cell, continued to write. His letters were philosophical, sometimes mystical. He read obsessively Buddhism, Crowley, mythology, quantum physics. It was his way of surviving. "They can't kill my mind," he wrote. "That's the part they can't reach." Meanwhile, Jason Baldwin spent his days in quiet resilience, earning his GED and avoiding prison gangs. Jessie Misskelley, less articulate but deeply loyal, refused to testify against his friends even when offered a reduced sentence. The 3 remained bound, not by blood, but by tragedy. By the late 1990s, whispers of injustice began to grow louder. A small but determined movement had taken shape, the Free the West Memphis Three campaign. What started as fan letters turned into petitions, investigative documentaries, and legal efforts funded by artists like Metallica, Eddie Vedder, and Johnny Depp. The tide was turning, but the system that had condemned them was not easily swayed. For years, officials refused to reopen the case, insisting that justice had been served. Behind the prison walls, Damien continued to count the days, wondering if he would die for a crime he did not commit. And yet, somewhere in the darkness, the first glimmer of light appeared. A filmmaker's camera had begun to roll, capturing what would become one of the most powerful true crime documentaries of all time. The world was about to look again at West Memphis, and this time it would see the truth differently. Paradise Lost, the documentary that changed everything. In 1996, 3 years after the convictions, the world saw West Memphis through a new lens. The HBO documentary Paradise Lost, The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills, directed by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, brought the story out of Arkansas and into millions of homes across America. For the first time, the public could see what the courtroom had looked like, how the prosecution had built its case, and how little real evidence there had been. And what they saw was disturbing. The film opened with haunting images, the small-town streets, the grieving families, and the eerie calm of the woods where the boys were found. It did not sensationalize the murders. Instead, it asked a quiet, terrifying question: had the wrong people been condemned? According to official transcripts, the filmmakers had been granted unprecedented access to the trial and the defendants. Their cameras recorded the prosecutor's confident speeches, the defense's desperate objections, and the hollow weight of the evidence that supposedly proved guilt. Viewers saw Damien Echols, articulate and introspective, speaking from death row with intelligence and restraint. They saw Jason Baldwin, barely an adult, answering questions with disarming honesty. And they saw Jessie Misskelley, confused, broken, and haunted by a confession he could barely remember giving. The reaction was immediate and polarizing. For some, Paradise Lost was an act of blasphemy, an attack on justice and the pain of grieving parents. But for many others, it was a revelation. Journalists began re-examining the case files. Legal experts noted glaring errors in procedure and inconsistencies in witness statements. Even law enforcement veterans expressed discomfort at how the investigation had been handled. The film revealed that crucial physical evidence, like a supposed satanic knife, had never been properly tested for blood or fingerprints. It showed that witnesses who testified against Damien and Jason had been offered rewards or faced pressure from police. One witness, Vicky Hutchison, later admitted she had fabricated her story about occult gatherings to please investigators. The foundation of the prosecution's narrative began to crumble in real time under the glare of national attention. Outside Arkansas, the story sparked something larger, a cultural reckoning with the satanic panic of the 1980s and early 1990s. Across the country, people began questioning how many lives had been destroyed by hysteria masquerading as justice. The phrase, the West Memphis Three, entered public vocabulary, not as monsters, but as victims of fear and prejudice. Meanwhile, officials in West Memphis were furious. Prosecutors denounced the documentary as biased propaganda. Judge David Burnett, who had presided over the trials, refused to comment publicly but privately called the filmmakers reckless outsiders. The police department issued statements insisting that justice had been served and warning that outsiders were reopening old wounds. Yet the damage was done. The world had seen too much. College students began organizing screenings and fundraisers. Musicians, Metallica, Pearl Jam, Henry Rollins, lent their voices to the cause, financing legal appeals and awareness campaigns. The case that had once been buried in local rumor was now front-page news again. Damien, Jason, and Jessie suddenly had allies, powerful ones. Defense lawyers filed motions for new DNA testing, citing technological advancements that hadn't existed in 1993. Supporters launched websites, mailing lists, and rallies calling for a retrial. It was a slow awakening, but it was unstoppable. Still, for all the hope Paradise Lost inspired, it also reignited pain. The families of the murdered boys accused the filmmakers of exploiting their tragedy. They still believed justice had been served, that the men behind bars were guilty. The divide between grief and truth deepened, creating two opposing versions of reality. As the closing credits rolled, a haunting question lingered. If 3 innocent boys were in prison, who had really killed the children of West Memphis? The film ended without an answer, but it ensured that the world would never stop asking. New evidence and old lies. The case reopens by the early 2000s. The ground beneath the West Memphis Three case began to shift. What had once been an open and shut conviction started to unravel. Piece by piece, under the weight of new evidence, scientific advancements, and growing public pressure. The same system that had condemned 3 teenagers now faced the uncomfortable truth: it might have been wrong. According to court filings, defense attorneys began pushing for DNA testing using methods that were unavailable in 1993. Samples taken from the crime scene, hair strands, blood traces, fibers were re-examined under modern technology. The results were staggering. None of the biological evidence matched Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, or Jessie Misskelley. Instead, A hair found tied into one of the ligatures appeared consistent with the stepfather of one of the victims, Terry Hobbs. The discovery sent shockwaves through both legal teams. For years, Hobbs had largely avoided scrutiny. He had never been called as a witness, nor questioned as a suspect. But now, investigators and journalists began looking at him differently. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Hobbs with the boys on the night they disappeared. A neighbor alleged that she had overheard an argument between him and his wife after the murders, something about being seen near the woods. Hobbs denied all accusations, insisting he had nothing to do with the crime. But the shadow of suspicion had shifted. Meanwhile, the original prosecution's narrative began to collapse under renewed scrutiny. The so-called satanic ritual theory, once taken as gospel, was now openly mocked by criminologists and forensic experts. Studies showed that there had never been any verified case of satanic cult killings in the United States. The West Memphis Three had been convicted not on evidence, but on fear. Fear of the unknown, of youth culture, of heavy metal, of difference. In 2007, the defense filed a motion for a new trial, citing the DNA findings and the unreliability of Jessie Misskelley's confession. They also uncovered proof that some jurors had discussed the confession during deliberations, despite being told it was inadmissible in court. In any other case, it would have been grounds for immediate retrial. But in Arkansas, the courts moved slowly, guardedly, perhaps afraid of admitting such a colossal failure. As the legal drama unfolded, the public debate grew louder. Documentaries, online forums, and advocacy groups continued to dissect every piece of evidence. Free the West Memphis Three rallies took place in major cities across the US and Europe. What had begun as a local tragedy was now a global cause. Inside the prison walls, Damien, Jason, and Jessie waited. Hope was a dangerous thing. It had betrayed them before, but now it felt tangible. "We were ghosts for years," Damien wrote in one of his letters. "Now the world can finally see us." Yet not everyone welcomed the revelations. Prosecutors accused the defense of fabricating doubt. Victims' families remained divided. Some demanded the death penalty be carried out. Others quietly admitted they no longer knew what to believe. The town of West Memphis itself became a living wound, split between those who wanted to move on and those who could not. In 2010, a judge finally agreed to review the case. The courtroom, once a theater of hysteria, now filled with journalists, advocates, and weary faces that had aged under the burden of injustice. The truth was surfacing, but whether it would set anyone free remained uncertain. According to one legal observer, the problem wasn't just bad evidence. It was that no one wanted to be the first to say the system had failed. After nearly 2 decades of silence, the truth had begun to whisper. But whispers, in West Memphis, had always been dangerous. The Alford plea, freedom with chains. On August 19, 2011, after more than 18 years behind bars, the West Memphis Three walked out of prison. But their freedom came with a price, one written in the language of law, compromise, and unfinished justice. The mechanism was known as the Alford plea, a rarely used legal maneuver that allowed the men to assert their innocence while formally pleading guilty. According to official court documents, the plea was negotiated in secret over several months. The state of Arkansas agreed to release Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley immediately, but only if they admitted guilt to the murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. In return, their original sentences would be reduced to time served. It was a deal born not of mercy, but of exhaustion. Inside the crowded courtroom, the three men stood before Judge David Laser. Television cameras captured every movement. The tremble in Jessie's hands, Jason's quiet composure, and Damien's piercing stare. He looked older, thinner, his eyes hardened by years in solitary confinement. "This is not justice," Damien said later, "but it's the closest thing we'll ever get." The plea was a paradox. By accepting it, they secured their release, yet the state avoided admitting any wrongdoing. It was, in essence, a bureaucratic truce. Prosecutors could still claim the case was solved, While the defense could argue that the men had been wrongfully convicted, no one had to say the system had failed. For Jason Baldwin, it was an agonizing decision. He had always refused to admit guilt, even when offered reduced sentences in the past. "I couldn't say I did something I didn't do," he once said. But when he learned that Damien's life might depend on the deal, still facing a death sentence, he agreed. "I did it for him," Jason told reporters, "because he wouldn't have survived another year on death row." Jessie Misskelley signed quietly. He had long ago lost faith in the system that had used his confession to destroy them. For Damien, the moment was surreal, a door opening after half a lifetime in a cage. "You think about freedom every day," he later wrote, "but when it comes, you don't know how to hold it." As the judge read the final ruling, the words echoed through the courtroom. "Time served. Released forthwith." The men were escorted outside into blinding daylight. Supporters cheered, cameras flashed, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Damien felt the sun without a wall between him and the sky. But beneath the applause, the truth lingered. The records still called them murderers. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Do you feel justice has been done?" one asked. Damien paused before answering, his voice steady but cold. "Justice isn't something you sign for. It's something you fight for, and we're still fighting." The families of the victims stood divided. Some accepted the plea as closure. Others called it a travesty, a manipulation that robbed them of truth. Terry Hobbs, still shadowed by suspicion, appeared in interviews claiming vindication. "They confessed again," he said, but the world had moved on, and few believed him. The release of the West Memphis Three marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Though free, they were bound by the very system that had wronged them. The plea ensured they could never sue the state for wrongful conviction, never demand an official apology, never truly clear their names. It was freedom, but only by technicality. As night fell that day, Damien wrote his first journal entry outside prison walls. It ended with a single line: "I am free, but the truth is still imprisoned." The story of the West Memphis Three should have ended there. But justice, once distorted, never truly returns to shape. The question remained, how many other stories like theirs were buried beneath the silence of small-town America? Aftermath, freedom and the weight of the past. Freedom did not come with peace. For Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley, the outside world was not the one they had left behind. Nearly 2 decades had passed, entire generations grown, technology transformed, towns rebuilt, and yet the shadow of West Memphis followed them like a specter. Though they were free men, the word murderer still clung to their names in every database, every background check, every curious glance. According to interviews conducted shortly after their release, reintegration was far from easy. Jesse, quiet and withdrawn, struggled with public life. He avoided cameras, rarely gave interviews, and preferred to stay close to family. Jason tried to rebuild himself through education, enrolling in college and advocating for prison reform. "If we can stop what happened to us from happening to anyone else," he said, "then maybe there's a reason we went through it." For Damien, freedom was a paradox. After years on death row, sunlight felt foreign, people overwhelming, silence unsettling. He moved to New York with his wife, Lori Davis, a woman who had begun writing to him while he was in prison and had become his greatest ally. Together, they tried to build a life from the fragments of lost time. Yet every interview, every question, every book signing carried the same undertone: did you do it? In his memoir, Damien wrote, "The world moves fast, but trauma moves slowly. I left a cell behind, but part of it came with me. The physical bars were gone, but invisible ones remained, made of memory, rumor, and the haunting echo of injustice." Meanwhile, the case continued to evolve. Advocates pushed for a full exoneration, armed with new DNA data and fresh expert testimony. But the state of Arkansas refused to reopen the case. Officials cited finality of judgment. For them, the story was over. For the 3 men who lived it, it was not. Documentaries and books continued to keep the story alive. A second and third Paradise Lost film were released, chronicling their journey from imprisonment to release. Each film added layers to the narrative, the transformation of villains into victims, and the uncomfortable truth that justice is not always found in courtrooms. Public opinion shifted further, where once the majority believed in their guilt, now most Americans saw them as symbols of wrongful conviction. But freedom carried its own weight. Death threats still arrived in the mail. Online forums dissected their every move, arguing endlessly about guilt or innocence. Some accused them of profiting from tragedy. Others saw them as prophets of perseverance. For every supporter, there remained a skeptic unwilling to let go of the past. Damien became an outspoken critic of the American justice system, speaking at universities and human rights conferences. Jason joined organizations advocating for prisoners' education and fair trials. Jessie stayed quiet, preferring a modest life far from the spotlight. Three men, forever connected by one night in 1993, now walked different paths through the same shared shadow. In one interview, Damien said softly, "They took everything from us. Our youth, our peace, our names. But they didn't take our will. We're still here." The legacy of the West Memphis Three extended far beyond the borders of Arkansas. Their story inspired new generations of activists, lawyers, and filmmakers to question the machinery of justice itself. Law schools studied the case as a cautionary tale. Podcasts revisited it as a tragedy of misplaced faith. And yet, beneath the advocacy and applause, a deeper melancholy lingered. Because while they had escaped prison, the real killer of 3 children had never been found. That truth hung like a storm cloud over everything, a reminder that freedom and justice are not the same thing. The world moved on, but West Memphis never truly healed, and neither did they. The unanswered questions: who killed the boys? For all the evidence re-examined, for all the documentaries and public outcry, one truth remained untouched: the real killer, or killers, of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers had never been found. Beneath the layers of hysteria, politics, and redemption, the crime itself remained unsolved. And in that vacuum of certainty, theories multiplied like shadows in the woods. According to police archives, the official investigation was effectively closed once Damien, Jason, and Jessie were convicted in 1994. But decades later, re-examination of the files revealed glaring inconsistencies. The timeline of the boys' disappearance didn't align with witness statements. The supposed site of the murders, the Robin Hood Hills Creek, showed no signs of struggle or drag marks. Experts suggested the children might have been killed elsewhere and moved post-mortem. Then there were the physical clues, long ignored or mishandled. A knife discovered in a lake behind the home of Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch, was initially dismissed. Later tests found it consistent with the wounds on the victims, though contamination prevented conclusive proof. A hair found in one of the ligatures matched Hobbs through mitochondrial DNA. His alibi shifted across interviews, and his relationships with neighbors were filled with tension and fear. Yet no charges were ever filed. Hobbs was not the only name whispered in the years that followed. Another man, David Jacoby, a friend of Hobbs, was seen with him the night the boys disappeared. Witnesses claimed the two were together near the woods, and some suggested the boys were last seen playing with them. Both denied involvement, and police showed little interest in reopening those leads. There were also strange details buried in the original evidence logs. Blood found in the Bojangles restaurant bathroom near the crime scene. A man seen covered in mud and disoriented the night of the murders. Reports of screams and splashing heard at inconsistent times. Each thread seemed to lead nowhere, cut short by the assumption that the case was already solved. When investigators revisited the files, years later, many of these pieces of evidence were missing or degraded. Some samples had been lost, others destroyed. "We can't find them," one official admitted during a 2008 deposition. Prosody, the phrase became emblematic of the entire investigation, a chain of custody lost in fear, incompetence, or perhaps something darker. Forensic experts who reviewed the case in the 2010s argued that the original pathology reports were misinterpreted. The supposed mutilations, that fueled the satanic panic may have been the result of post-mortem animal activity. Turtles, specifically, which inhabit the same shallow waters where the bodies were found. It was a chilling irony, nature itself mistaken for ritual evil. But the most haunting question remains: if not Damien, Jason, and Jessie, then who? Some believe the answer lies within the families, citing behavioral red flags and domestic violence records. Others suspect a transient predator passing through town, someone who slipped away unseen. A few point to police negligence so profound that the truth was simply buried beneath their mistakes. In West Memphis, asking such questions is still taboo. To challenge the official story is to reopen old wounds, to remind the town that justice may have never been served. Even today, some officers who work the case refuse interviews, their silence heavy with the weight of what might have been missed or ignored. As one investigator later said off record, "Everyone wanted the devil. No one wanted the truth." The woods of Robin Hood Hills have long since grown over. The creek still runs, quiet and unremarkable. Children play there again, unaware of what was found beneath its surface. But for those who remember, the air still holds a chill, as if the land itself remembers. The crime that defined West Memphis remains unsolved. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Echoes in the media, from tragedy to myth, over the decades, the case of the West Memphis Three transcended the boundaries of law and evidence. It became something larger, an American myth woven from tragedy, obsession, and the blurred lines between truth and narrative. What began as a local horror story in a small Arkansas town evolved into a cultural mirror reflecting the fears, flaws, and fascination of an entire nation. When Paradise Lost first aired, it redefined how the media approached crime. For the first time, viewers saw not only the brutality of the murders, but also the machinery of justice itself, exposed, imperfect, and deeply human. Subsequent documentaries, Paradise Lost 2, Revelations, 2000, Paradise Lost 3, Purgatory, 2011, and Amy Berg's West of Memphis, 2012, transformed the story into a saga of endurance and redemption. Each film peeled back another layer of myth, revealing a deeper rot beneath the surface of small-town righteousness. But with every retelling came reinterpretation. To some, Damien Echols became a symbol of resilience, an artist forged in the crucible of injustice. To others, he remained an enigma, a man whose fascination with the occult never fully lost its shadow. The narrative evolved, shaped not by courts or evidence, but by cameras, editors, and the collective imagination of millions. Music played its part too. Metallica, whose songs once painted Damien as a devil in the eyes of jurors, granted their music to the Paradise Lost filmmakers, signaling a reversal of public perception. Artists like Eddie Vedder, Johnny Depp, and Henry Rollins became advocates, their fame amplifying a story that once belonged only to Arkansas. The cause turned into a movement, the movement into legend. Social media later breathed new life into the myth. Online forums, podcasts, and Reddit threads kept the debate alive long after the men's release. Amateur sleuths dissected every frame of footage, every transcript, every overlooked clue. Some sought justice, others sought mystery. The case had become digital folklore, a story that refused to end. Meanwhile, journalists began to question their own role. Had the media, in its zeal to right a wrong, created new distortions of its own? Was the public now invested in innocence as blindly as it once had been in guilt? One writer for The Atlantic observed, "The West Memphis Three no longer exist in the realm of fact. They exist in the realm of narrative." Hollywood soon followed. Screenplays circulated, dramatizing the events with artistic liberties and emotional arcs. Each retelling distanced the story further from its origin. The victims, the three murdered boys, faded into symbols, their lives overshadowed by the mythology that grew from their deaths. Even those fighting for justice admitted an uncomfortable truth. In the age of media, stories sometimes matter more than people. Damien Echols himself became a reluctant celebrity. His books, art exhibits, and interviews drew both admiration and skepticism. "People see what they want to see," he once said. "Some want me to be innocent, some want me to be guilty. But I just want to be human again." His words captured the strange paradox of modern myth-making. The more a story resonates, the less real it becomes. In classrooms and crime podcasts, the West Memphis Three are now case study and cautionary tale, symbols of how fear can twist justice, and how fame can rewrite history. Yet the true core of the story remains buried under layers of interpretation. The media turned pain into spectacle, injustice into entertainment, and tragedy into legend. In the end, West Memphis became more than a place. It became a metaphor for fear, for ignorance, for the hunger to believe in monsters, and later, for the need to find heroes. And somewhere between those extremes, the truth still waits, silent, unseen, and unsatisfied. Legacy of doubt. Lessons from West Memphis. The story of the West Memphis Three did more than expose a flawed investigation. It forced America to confront its uneasy relationship with fear, belief, and justice. In the decades that followed, the case became a cautionary tale taught in law schools, cited in criminal justice reforms, and referenced in debates about media influence and public hysteria. But beneath those lessons, one truth persisted. Doubt became the only certainty. According to legal scholars, the West Memphis case illuminated how easily justice can be swayed by narrative. The absence of evidence was replaced by symbolism. The courtroom became a stage for morality rather than law. It revealed how institutions, under pressure to deliver answers, often trade truth for closure. The cost, as always, was human life. In response to public outrage, several states began re-examining interrogation practices. The recording of entire sessions, rather than edited excerpts, became a growing legal standard. Cases involving minors or intellectually disabled suspects were now scrutinized more carefully, shaped by the haunting image of Jessie Misskelley's coerced confession. Police departments across the country quietly revised their procedures, afraid of becoming the next West Memphis. Forensic science, too, evolved. The rise of DNA testing and independent crime labs reduced reliance on so-called expert testimony rooted in psychology or superstition. The satanic panic that had fueled the 1990s faded into history, replaced by skepticism toward moral panics of all kinds. Yet in its absence grew a new danger, the cult of certainty, the belief that science alone could solve every mystery. West Memphis reminded the world that evidence can be as fragile as faith. The cultural shift extended beyond the courts. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers transformed the tragedy into activism. The phrase, "Free the West Memphis Three," became shorthand for challenging wrongful convictions. Innocence projects nationwide cited the case as proof that public advocacy could rewrite fate. But for every success, countless other injustices remained invisible, lacking the cameras, celebrities, or soundtracks that had given this one its power. Still, for all the reforms and revelations, true closure never came. The Alford plea ensured that no one in authority had to admit wrongdoing. The files were never reopened. The real killer was never found. The state moved on, the public moved on, but the wound remained open, festering quietly beneath the surface of American justice. In interviews years later, Damien Echols reflected on what the case had taught him. "They say the truth sets you free," he said. "But the truth can be buried, rewritten, and sold. What sets you free is surviving it." His words echoed beyond the personal. They spoke to an entire system built on fragile foundations of perception and belief. Law professors now cite the case when discussing confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and the dangers of public prosecution. Students study it not as a mystery, but as anatomy, an autopsy of how truth dies under the weight of fear. The term West Memphis effect entered criminology slang, a shorthand for any case where moral panic overwhelms logic. But perhaps the greatest lesson lies not in law or science, but in memory. The West Memphis Three forced America to question what it believes about evil, how it looks, who embodies it, and how easily it can be misidentified. In the end, the case wasn't about Satan or sacrifice, but about the fragility of reason when the world demands certainty. The woods of Robin Hood Hills are quiet now. The creek flows as it always did, indifferent to the stories told about it. Yet somewhere, in classrooms, courtrooms, and quiet conversations, the echoes continue, a whisper that justice is not infallible, and that truth, once lost, may never return whole. The legacy of West Memphis is not innocence or guilt, it is doubt. And perhaps that is the only honest conclusion humanity can ever reach. Epilogue: justice or witch hunt. There are stories that end with justice served, and there are stories that end with silence. The case of the West Memphis Three belongs to neither. It lingers somewhere in between, a shadow stretching across decades, too haunting to fade and too fractured to heal. For some, it remains proof that truth prevails. For others, it is evidence that justice is as fallible as the people who build it. According to official records, the case is closed, the convictions stand, the files are sealed, and the state considers the matter resolved. But outside the courthouse walls, the debate endures. Each year, new voices discover the story, drawn to its contradictions. The brutality of the crime, the frailty of the investigation, the quiet endurance of the accused. Every retelling breathes new life into an old wound. What makes this story so unforgettable is not the horror of the murders themselves, but the reflection they cast on human nature. In the mirror of West Memphis, the world saw its own fears: fear of difference, fear of chaos, fear of the unknown. It was easier to invent demons than to confront complexity. And so, the town conjured evil in the faces of three teenagers who dressed in black, listened to metal, and dreamed beyond the fences of conformity. Decades later, the question remains: was it justice or was it a witch hunt? The answer shifts depending on where one stands. For the victims' families, it may always be justice. They needed closure, someone to bear the weight of grief. For the West Memphis Three and their supporters, it was persecution, a trial not of evidence, but of appearance. For the system itself, it was survival, a compromise that allowed everyone to move on without admitting failure. Damien Echols once said, "They wanted the devil. They got 3 boys." His words linger like a curse, a reminder that truth can be a casualty of fear. The hysteria that consumed West Memphis may have faded, but the pattern repeats across time and place. A crime, a scapegoat, a verdict that soothes but does not solve. Today, the woods of Robin Hood Hills are quiet again. The creek where the boys were found flows beneath the same southern sky. There is no plaque, no memorial, no sign of what once transpired there. Only silence and memory. Sometimes locals say you can still hear the water moving differently at night, as if the earth itself remembers. Historians, criminologists, and filmmakers continue to debate what truly happened in 1993. But perhaps the real lesson lies beyond facts and theories. Perhaps it lies in the way we seek certainty where none exists. In the end, the West Memphis Three remind us that justice is not an absolute. It is a fragile idea, one that can be bent by fear, faith, and the hunger for answers. The story ends, but the questions remain. What if the wrong men were punished? What if the right ones walk free? And what does that say about us, the society that demands closure more than truth? No one will ever know exactly what happened in those woods. The evidence has faded, the witnesses have vanished, and the memories are blurred by time. All that remains is the echo of a question whispered through the years, a question that refuses to die. Was it justice or a witch hunt? The answer, perhaps, is both. And that is what makes the story of the West Memphis Three not just a case, but a warning, a reflection of the darkness we all carry, and the fragile light we still call justice.